Look at your left hand. The fourth finger. There is a vein inside that finger that travels directly to your heart. At least that is what they told you. Cut that finger open and you will find nothing unique. The Vena Amoris, the supposed vein of love, is a lie. An anatomical fiction invented to sell you an illusion. I have an object sitting on my desk right now from case file SC-0860-ROM. It is heavy, cold to the touch. It is forged from crude iron, rusted a deep, violent brown from 2,000 years buried in the dirt outside Rome. It is a ring. But if you look closely at the top, right where a diamond is supposed to sit today, there is no setting for a precious stone. There is a small, jagged piece of metal protruding outward. It is a tiny, functional key. They tell us the wedding ring is a perfect circle, unbroken, a symbol of endless devotion and mutual respect. That is a highly profitable fairy tale. The truth hidden in the archives is much darker. Wedding rings were never about love. They were never about partnership. They were a mechanism of control, a warning sign permanently attached to the human body. The Romans called it the Anulus Pronubus. We call it the engagement ring. The modern story claims that ancient civilizations believed in the vein of love, and so they placed the ring on that specific finger to bind the heart. But Roman doctors knew better. Galen, the most famous physician of the ancient world, mapped the human circulatory system. He dissected bodies. He knew perfectly well there was no single magical vein connecting the fourth finger to the heart. Every finger has veins. Every vein eventually leads to the heart. The medical establishment of Rome knew the Vena Amoris was a biological impossibility. They knew it was a myth, yet they enforced the tradition anyway. Why? Why did they insist on placing this heavy iron band on that exact finger? Because of what that hand represented. The left hand was universally considered the weaker hand, the inferior hand. In Latin, the word for left is sinister. It meant unlucky, defective. You do not place a restrictive, heavy iron band on a citizen's dominant hand. You place it on the weak hand, the submissive hand, the hand that does not fight back. When a Roman citizen gave this iron ring to his bride, he did not do it beneath the flower arch while reciting romantic vows. He did it in a room full of older men in front of state witnesses to finalize a strict financial transaction. Under Roman civil law, this marriage process involved a legal transfer called manus. The word literally translates to hand. The woman was legally transferred from the ownership of her father directly into the ownership of her husband. She lost all legal independence. She could not own property. She could not sign contracts in her own name. She became an asset. The iron ring was not a promise of fidelity. It was a receipt of purchase. Iron was chosen deliberately. It was cheap, durable, and impossible to break without heavy tools. It left a dark stain on the skin if worn too long. Once it went on, it stayed on. It signaled to every other man in the city that this specific woman was claimed by another citizen. Touching her was no longer just a personal insult to her husband. It was a severe property crime against the state. The ring was a boundary line drawn in metal, but that still does not explain the small key protruding from the top of the ring sitting on my desk. If the ring was just a visual brand, a simple circle of iron would do the job perfectly. The Romans were master engineers. They did not add functional keys to everyday objects without a very specific utilitarian reason. The bride was required to wear this key at all times. She slept with it. She bathed with it. It was physically tied to her flesh day and night. She was carrying the key, but she was never the one who controlled what it opened. The Roman household was not a home. It was a corporation, and the husband was the sole shareholder. Under the law of paterfamilias, the man had the power of life and death over everyone under his roof, his children, his slaves, his wife. He owned the grain. He owned the oil. He owned the wine. And in a society where untreated water could kill you, wine was liquid currency. A wife drinking her husband's wine without permission was a severe crime. The law permitted a man to execute his wife if he caught her drinking from his reserves. He needed a way to protect his assets when he left the house. He needed a security system. That is exactly what the wedding ring was designed to be. The iron key protruding from the band was not meant to open the front door. It was meant to lock the wooden cabinets. In ancient Rome, the iron wedding ring wasn't a promise of fidelity. It was a portable wax seal used to lock the husband's cabinets and prevent his wife from stealing his property. Picture the morning routine. The husband prepares to leave for the forum. He walks to the cellar. He takes a candle, melting red wax over the lip of the wine jars and the lock of the grain chest. He turns to his wife. He takes her left hand. He presses the iron ring on her fourth finger directly into the hot wax. The metal leaves a permanent, unique impression. It cools. It hardens. This was a masterclass in psychological control. By forcing her to wear the seal, he made her the warden of her own prison. She could not steal from the pantry because the lock required the exact shape of the ring permanently attached to her hand. If a jar was opened, the broken wax would prove it. If she tried to forge a new seal, the wax would not match the iron key she was forced to wear. The ring was an audit mechanism, a wearable polygraph test. Every time she looked at her left hand, she saw a piece of heavy metal reminding her that she was a suspect in her own home. For centuries, this was the standard. Women walked the streets of Rome with iron keys and heavy seals bound to their fingers. Their hands were stained black from the cheap metal oxidizing against their skin. The stain was intentional. If a woman somehow managed to pry the tight iron ring off her finger to escape or hide her marital status, the dark circle left behind on her skin exposed her immediately. She was marked property. You might think society evolved. You might assume that as the empire fell and the centuries passed, humanity left this barbaric practice in the dirt. We stopped treating women like cattle. We stopped using iron rings as inventory tracking devices. That is the story the modern jewelry industry relies on. They want you to believe that somewhere along the line, the ring organically transformed into a beautiful, romantic gesture. But I read the church records from the 9th century. I tracked the exact moment the narrative shifted. The transition from crude iron to shiny gold had absolutely nothing to do with romance. It was not a cultural awakening. It was a calculated mandate from a man who realized that if you want to control an entire continent, you do not use iron. Iron is too obvious. You use gold. You take the chains, you polish them until they shine, and you convince the prisoner to buy them voluntarily. In the year 860, the Vatican issued a decree that changed the financial and psychological landscape of the world forever. A decree that explains why you, or someone you know, spent a fortune on a small metal circle. Yeah, I tracked down the original Vatican correspondence in the archives. The parchment is thin, covered in dense Latin script. The year was 866 AD, though the political groundwork started at the beginning of the decade. Pope Nicholas I drafted a document known as the Responses to the Bulgarians. It reads less like a religious text and more like a corporate merger strategy. At the time, marriage across Europe was largely unregulated. It was a private, civil matter. Two families met in a home, agreed on a dowry, and exchanged whatever simple tokens they had. Braided leather, copper wire, bone. The church had almost zero administrative control over these daily asset transfers. Nicholas realized that to govern the population, the church needed to monopolize the institution of marriage. And to do that, they needed to own the symbol. He studied the old Roman tradition of the Anulus Pronubus. He understood the psychological power of a permanent physical marker, but he also knew he could not force free citizens to wear iron. Iron was the metal of chains. It left rust on the skin. It screamed of physical ownership and slavery. So Nicholas issued his mandate. He officially decreed that a marriage was only recognized as valid and holy if the groom presented a ring of gold. This single decree created an instant, artificial financial barrier to entry for human partnership. A man had to sacrifice a significant portion of his wealth to prove his commitment, and the church positioned itself as the sole auditor of that transaction. But the Vatican faced a massive psychological problem. How do you convince generations of people to voluntarily buy expensive metal? And how do you convince women to wear it on the exact same finger the Romans used to brand their wives as property? You rewrite biology. The church actively resurrected the Vena Amoris myth. They completely buried the accurate medical texts of Galen and the Roman anatomists. They told the uneducated masses that the Creator deliberately placed a sacred vein in the fourth finger of the left hand, running straight to the heart. It was a masterpiece of social engineering. The Romans chose the fourth finger of the left hand because it was the sinister hand, the weak hand, the hand that could not hold a sword or sign a legal document, the submissive hand. The church kept the ring on that exact same submissive finger, but they painted it gold and wrapped it in romantic doctrine. They removed the physical iron key that locked the wine cellar, but they installed a much stronger lock, a psychological one. I closed the heavy leather cover of case file SC-0860-ROM. I pick up the rusted Roman ring from the desk. The crude iron is rough against my palm. The tiny key is still sharp enough to cut skin. Today, global diamond cartels spend billions to keep Pope Nicholas's marketing campaign alive. They flood screens with images of unbroken circles and endless devotion. They rely on you never looking into the archives. Look at your left hand one last time. You aren't wearing a circle of infinite love. You are wearing a 2,000-year-old anti-theft device successfully rebranded by the church. You paid a premium for the privilege of attaching a receipt to your own flesh. If you found the origin of your wedding band disturbing, wait until I pull the declassified files on why we actually blow out candles on a birthday cake. The original purpose had absolutely nothing to do with making a wish.